I never thought a simple family dinner could strip away years of denial in a single sentence. I was sitting at the same table where I had poured my savings, $59,000, to save our restaurant, when my father calmly set down his fork and said, "No one needs your money or you anymore." My mother kept eating. My sister looked pleased. And in that silence, I realized something they didn't. I had been preparing for this moment longer than they knew. The call came late in the afternoon, the kind of hour when the light outside starts to thin and everything feels slightly unsettled. I remember the way my stomach tightened before my mom even finished saying hello. There was something in her voice, strained, brittle, almost rehearsed. She didn't waste time. "We need you to come to the restaurant," she said. "It's urgent." I drove there with a heaviness I couldn't quite name. The BBQ place had always been loud, full of clattering plates and the sharp comfort of smoke and sauce in the air. But when I walked in that day, it felt like a memory of itself. Chairs were stacked unevenly. The lights seemed dimmer. The air carried stress instead of spice. Dad was behind the counter, surrounded by paper. Not menus, not receipts from a busy lunch rush. Invoices, overdue notices, final warnings. He pushed a stack toward me without meeting my eyes. I scanned the numbers slowly, my chest tightening with every line. Late payments, vendor holds, bank pressure. The kind of debt that doesn't whisper, it threatens. "You're our last hope," he said. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't raise his voice. That almost made it worse. The weight of it pressed harder than the numbers ever could. I asked quietly, "What about Erin?" Mom shook her head immediately. "She's dealing with her own things." As if on cue, my sister appeared from the hallway in pajamas, hair still messy, asking what Mom planned to make for dinner. She didn't glance at the invoices, didn't ask what was wrong. Mom brushed her hair back gently, reassuring her about something trivial, then turned to me with eyes that held expectation. No room for refusal, no acknowledgement of how familiar this position felt. I needed air. So I left and met Calvin at a small cafe near our old school. It was quiet there, the kind of place where conversations don't echo. I told him everything. The debt, the foreclosure threats, Dad's words. He listened the way he always does, calm, measured, careful not to judge. "You've stepped in before," he reminded me, "and it's never really changed anything." I knew he was right. I had covered emergencies, smoothed over conflicts, absorbed blame, and somehow it always reset back to me being the dependable one, the one who would fix it. "Maybe this time it will," I said, though the words sounded thinner out loud. Calvin tilted his head slightly. "Or maybe this is just another cycle." That question followed me all the way back to the restaurant that evening. The atmosphere hadn't changed. The debt hadn't shrunk in the few hours I was gone. Dad handed me more documents as if the stack itself might convince me. Mom stood beside him, a strange mixture of desperation and relief in her expression, like my presence alone signaled the solution had arrived. Erin walked through again, commenting on how exhausting her day had been. There was no mention of the business, no offer to help. Mom responded with soft concern, then shifted her attention back to me. I read through every page carefully. The truth was clear. Without immediate intervention, the restaurant wouldn't survive. And here's the part I wrestled with. I didn't just see a failing business. I saw childhood memories in those walls. I saw the nights Dad came home smelling like smoke and sweat. I saw Mom balancing books at the kitchen table. I saw all the years this place had fed our family. Was I supposed to let it collapse? But another voice inside me whispered something harder. If you save it, will they finally see you differently, or will they just expect you to do it again next time? The silence stretched as my parents watched me read. I could feel their anxiety tightening with every second I didn't speak. Finally, I took a slow breath. I'll cover it, I said. All of it. 59,000. The relief in the room was instant. It flooded their faces before they could hide it. But I added, holding up the final page, we're doing this properly. Dad frowned slightly. What do you mean? I want a written financial agreement, full transparency, terms, conditions. Mom nodded quickly, too quickly. Of course, whatever you need. Dad hesitated, saying it wasn't necessary that we were family. But necessity has a way of quieting pride. He agreed. I drafted the agreement carefully. Clear repayment structure, clear oversight, and one clause I didn't explain in detail, a protective measure in case transparency was ever compromised. I read it twice before signing. They didn't ask about the specifics. They were too focused on the rescue. When I finally put the pen down, the crisis seemed to dissolve in their eyes. Gratitude poured out of them, but it felt more like relief than appreciation. I slipped the signed agreement into my bag and stood up to leave. The weight of it pressed against my side as I walked out. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this would shift something. Maybe this time, stepping in wouldn't just save the restaurant. It would finally secure my place in the family. But even as I stepped into the evening air, a quiet unease settled in my chest. I had saved the business. What I didn't know yet was what it would cost me. A few weeks after the debt was cleared, the restaurant began to breathe again. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic turnaround, no sudden flood of applause. It started quietly, with deliveries arriving on time instead of being turned away, with the steady hum of the refrigerators fully stocked again, with the smell of brisket drifting out to the sidewalk before sunrise. I arrived earlier than anyone. Most mornings, the sky was still dark when I unlocked the doors. I checked the prep lists, reviewed inventory, adjusted orders, answered vendor emails, and rebuilt systems that had been neglected for months. There were scheduling gaps to fix, overtime logs to correct, supplier relationships to repair. Every small weakness the debt had exposed needed attention. I handled kitchen rotation, payroll tracking, weekly transfers, vendor negotiations, and customer feedback. When complaints came in, I responded personally. When employees were frustrated, I listened. I stayed until the last receipt printed most nights, because stability isn't something you assume, it's something you maintain. By the second week, the momentum shifted. Lunch lines stretched past the entrance. Regulars came back smiling like they'd been waiting for permission to return. Online ratings ticked upward. The energy inside the restaurant felt different, less desperate, more focused. Mom stood at the register with a brightness I hadn't seen in months. Dad lingered near the smokers, offering familiar nods to customers. For a moment, it felt like we had pulled something back from the edge together. And then Erin started showing up. At first, it was subtle. She'd walk in late morning with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She didn't write much on it. Mostly she observed. She lingered near the kitchen doors during rush hour, smiling at customers as if she'd been part of the rebuild from day one. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was finally stepping in. but her presence shifted the air. Conversations paused when she entered. She'd ask small questions in a tone that implied oversight rather than curiosity. Why are we running that special again? Who approved this vendor? Simple things, but the phrasing carried weight. Mom started glancing at her more often. Dad would ask her opinion about minor adjustments, things I had already analyzed and implemented. I told myself not to overinterpret it. The restaurant was stabilizing. There was room for more hands. Still, something felt rehearsed. A few days later, I noticed the first closed-door meeting. The storage room light was on, voices low. When I approached to grab a supply order sheet, the conversation stopped abruptly. "We're just discussing some ideas," Mom said lightly when they stepped out. Ideas for a business I had just rebuilt. Soon after, vendors began calling to confirm changes I hadn't approved. Adjusted order quantities, revised payment timing, slight alterations to weekly deliveries. "I thought Aaron cleared that with you," one supplier said casually over the phone. "Cleared what?" I checked the budget sheets the following morning and found revisions. Numbers adjusted, margins recalculated. The documents were placed neatly on my desk without explanation. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every change, every phone call, every new instruction that didn't pass through me first. Erin's involvement escalated slowly but deliberately. She walked through the kitchen with that same clipboard, offering suggestions to staff in front of others. "Let's speed up that plating process. Why are we prepping so early for that item?" Her tone wasn't aggressive, it was polished, public. One afternoon, she corrected one of my scheduling decisions in front of two newer employees. "I think we'll adjust that," she said lightly but firmly. "It's better this way." The employees looked at me carefully, unsure where authority rested. I simply nodded and returned to my work. Arguing would have created a spectacle. And in this family, spectacle always became ammunition. Mom and Dad began praising her more openly. When customers complimented the service, Mom would smile toward Erin. "She's really taken initiative," Mom said once, loud enough for the staff to hear. Dad added comments about her fresh perspective and natural instincts. I remembered the weeks when foreclosure threatened, when Erin hadn't stepped into the kitchen once. When she'd wandered through in pajamas asking about dinner while invoices stacked up like warnings. But I didn't remind them. Silence was sharper. Behind that silence, I watched patterns form. Meetings happen without me. Budget revisions appeared without consultation. Decisions were announced rather than discussed. Erin started reviewing financial log sections she had ignored entirely during the crisis. She'd flip through pages in the office with exaggerated focus, making small notes in the margins. I began noticing adjustments in the ledger. Minor, almost invisible shifts. A high-cost order moved to a different date. A supply expense categorized differently. Subtle edits that redirected responsibility. Not enough to scream fraud, just enough to reshape narrative. I studied the entries carefully, compared timestamps, matched them against my original records. The discrepancies were deliberate. One afternoon, she caught me reviewing the ledger. "We just need everything organized properly," she said softly. "Now that I'm stepping into a formal role. Her eyes lingered on me, measuring my reaction. I gave her none. Instead, I went back to work and documented the adjustments in a private file. Not to confront her immediately, but to understand how far this would go. Employees began approaching me quietly. They mentioned longer prep expectations Aaron introduced without adjusting shift lengths. They described being corrected in front of customers. The tone of the restaurant shifted, again, less collaborative, more performative. I listened. I advised patience. I avoided open resistance because I could feel something building. By the end of the month, the restaurant felt stable on the surface, but unstable underneath. Like a structure that looked polished while its foundation was quietly being rearranged. Then came the conversation. It happened in the office during a lull between lunch and dinner. Mom stood with her arms folded, expression soft, in a way that felt almost rehearsed. Dad leaned against the filing cabinet. "We've been thinking," Mom began. "You've done so much already." Dad nodded. "You shouldn't exhaust yourself." I stayed still. "We think it might be good." Mom continued for Aaron to manage things for a while. For a while. The phrase was gentle. The decision was not. Dad added, "She has a natural leadership style. The business is entering a stronger phase now. It needs fresh energy." Fresh energy? I understood then that the closed-door meetings weren't exploratory. They were decisive. Erin stepped into the office seconds later, confidence radiating off her like light. "I've already drafted a new operating model," she said, as if this were a promotion ceremony. Extended shifts, revised scheduling protocols, some menu adjustments to modernize things. Her voice carried certainty, rehearsed certainty. I listened carefully, identified the practical gaps in her plan, the strain it would put on staff, the risks to supplier timing. But I didn't challenge her, because this wasn't about operations anymore. It was about position. My parents watched me closely, waiting for resistance, waiting for proof that I was difficult, territorial, ungrateful. Instead, I nodded once, "If that's what you've decided." The words surprised even me with how steady they sounded. Inside, something shifted. Not fear, not anger, clarity. The restaurant I rebuilt was no longer mine to stabilize. The authority I earned was being handed away without acknowledgement. And the people who once called me their last hope were now congratulating someone else for standing on the foundation I poured. I returned to my desk and opened my private documentation file. Not to fight, but to prepare. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the shift. It was just the beginning. The changes began small enough to look accidental. One afternoon, after the dinner rush slowed, I sat alone in the office and opened the financial ledger to reconcile the week's numbers. At first glance, everything looked tidy, columns aligned, totals balanced. But when I compared the entries to the records I had backed up during the rebuild, something felt off. A high-cost meat order had been moved to an earlier date. A supply invoice that had clearly been approved during Aaron's expanded scheduling experiment was now time-stamped before her formal role began. A few payroll adjustments had been labeled as transitional corrections instead of new management decisions. Individually, none of it would raise alarms. Together, the pattern was deliberate. The edits were subtle, precise enough to redirect responsibility without drawing attention. Anyone skimming the books would assume the costs were part of the earlier recovery phase. My phase. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence stretch. The printer hummed faintly in the background. The restaurant sounded normal outside the office door, but inside something had shifted. Erin stepped in a few minutes later, holding that same clipboard she liked to carry. "You're reviewing the numbers?" she asked lightly. "I always do," I replied. She walked closer, glancing down at the open ledger. "We just need everything organized properly now that I'm stepping into a formal role. Clean records matter." Clean. Her tone was soft, but there was an edge beneath it. As if the implication was clear, the system needed correction now that she was in charge. I met her gaze briefly, long enough to understand that she knew I saw the edits, long enough for her to realize I wasn't going to react. "Of course," I said evenly. "Accuracy matters." She held my eyes for a second longer, then smiled and left the office. I didn't follow her. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because arguing would only feed the narrative forming around me, the idea that I was resistant, territorial, unwilling to let go. Instead, I saved copies of the altered records, time-stamped them, and added them to my private file. Documentation first, reaction later. That night, after the staff had gone home and the kitchen lights dimmed, I stayed behind. I reached into my bag and pulled out the financial agreement I had signed when I paid the $59,000. The paper felt heavier than it had weeks ago. I unfolded it carefully and reread the clause I had inserted, the one allowing full withdrawal of my capital if transparency within the partnership was compromised. At the time, it had felt like a precaution, a formality. Now it felt like foresight. The language was clear. If records were manipulated, if financial integrity was breached, I had the right to sever the arrangement completely. I traced the sentence slowly with my finger, feeling a quiet steadiness replace the confusion that had hovered over me for days. I wasn't imagining the shift. It was happening in ink. Outside, I could hear Aaron laughing with Mom near the register. Dad's voice followed, relaxed, confident. The restaurant looked stable, successful, almost celebratory. But beneath that surface, the foundation was being rewritten. And I realized something important in that quiet office. If I waited too long, the version of events they were constructing would become permanent. I folded the agreement carefully and slipped it back into my bag. The air in the restaurant felt different that evening, brighter on the outside, tighter underneath, like a performance about to reach its final act. A few nights later, my parents suggested we all have dinner together. They said it casually, but I already knew. Something had been decided. Dinner felt staged from the moment I walked in. The table was set too neatly. Mom had arranged the dishes with a brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dad leaned back in his chair with the calm posture of someone who believed a storm had already passed. Erin sat across from me, swirling her wine slowly, her expression composed, almost celebratory. The room carried a strange lightness. Not warmth, not comfort, just a careful kind of cheerfulness, like everyone had rehearsed their lines. I took my seat and folded my hands in my lap. No one mentioned the closed-door meetings. No one mentioned the ledger edits. No one mentioned the shift that had been building for weeks. Mom started with casual questions about the restaurant. "How are the evening numbers looking?" she asked. She already knew. She had discussed them with Aaron earlier that week. I wasn't part of those conversations anymore, but everyone at the table pretended that detail didn't matter. "They're steady," I said simply. Aaron leaned forward, ready. "Well," she began, her tone smooth, "this month has been incredible." She started listing accomplishments, the improved lunch flow, the revised prep timing, the supplier adjustments, the staffing structure, the operational stability. Each sentence erased me a little more. Every system she described was one I had rebuilt. Every strategic adjustment had come from the weeks I spent arriving before sunrise and leaving after midnight. The $59,000 that kept the doors open wasn't mentioned once. She spoke as if she had stepped into a broken system and single-handedly turned it around. Mom nodded proudly at every point. I always knew you had strong leadership instincts, she told Aaron, smiling in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Dad added approving comments between bites of food. It takes vision to move a business forward like that. Vision. Erin's confidence grew with each word of praise. She glanced at me occasionally, just long enough to register my reaction. Her smile was sharp, contained, deliberate. I watched quietly. It was strange how detached I felt. The more they rewrote the past weeks, the calmer I became. I wasn't fighting for recognition anymore. I was observing something much clearer. They needed this version of events. They needed Aaron to be the architect of success. They needed my role to shrink so hers could expand. It was easier to celebrate her than to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that they had once called me their last hope. Aaron lifted her glass slightly. The restaurant is thriving because I finally brought structure to it, she said. It just needed someone to take real control. The words hung in the air. Mom didn't correct her. Dad didn't hesitate. They accepted the sentence as fact. I felt the heat rise in my chest for a brief moment. Not anger exactly. Something closer to recognition. Recognition that this wasn't accidental. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was agreement. Dad set his fork down with careful precision. The small sound of metal against ceramic cut through the room louder than it should have. He looked directly at me. There was no anger in his expression, no embarrassment, just certainty. No one needs your money or you anymore. The sentence landed without echo. Mom kept eating. Aaron didn't flinch. The air didn't shift. It was as if they had all known this line was coming, as if they had already rehearsed it in quieter rooms. For a second, I felt something hollow open inside me. Not shock exactly, I had sensed this direction for weeks, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so cleanly, carried a different weight. No one needs your money or you anymore. Days after using that money to avoid collapse, Aaron leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, almost gentle. The restaurant is successful because of me, not you. She said it like a clarification, like correcting a minor misconception. I looked at her, then at Mom, then at Dad. None of them met my eyes with hesitation. There was no flicker of acknowledgement for the long mornings, the emergency calls, the documentation, the nights I balanced payroll while they slept. They didn't mention the sacrifices. They didn't mention the debt. They didn't mention the $59,000. It was as if those weeks had been erased entirely. I could have spoken. I could have listed every invoice I paid, every system I rebuilt, every ledger entry I preserved before it was altered, but I didn't. Experience had taught me something important about this family. The louder you argue, the easier they dismiss you. Truth becomes emotion. Emotion becomes instability. Instability becomes proof that you were never fit to lead. So I chose silence. In that silence, I studied them. I watched how Erin sat taller now, confident in the authority she believed she had secured. I noticed how Mom relaxed once a sentence was spoken, as if a burden had been lifted. I saw the way Dad's posture shifted, firm, final. This wasn't about the restaurant anymore. It was about position. They had drawn a line at this table, a clean separation between the crisis I had solved and the success they now wanted to claim. Dinner continued around me. Aaron talked about future expansions. Mom asked about menu innovations. Dad nodded at projections as if they were already guaranteed. I withdrew from the rhythm of the conversation. Not emotionally, strategically. Because in that stillness, I felt something settle inside me. Not hurt, clarity. They believed they no longer needed me. They believed the safety net would remain even if they denied its existence. They believed my role had been temporary. The meal ended the way it began, neatly. Plates cleared, chairs pushed in, smiles exchanged. I stood slowly. No argument, no raised voice, no defense. Just a quiet resolve that surprised even me. If they truly believed they no longer needed me, then they were about to learn what that meant. I left the house that night without looking back. And before I went to sleep, I made a decision. In the morning, I would act. I woke up the next morning with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. The house was quiet as I got ready. No dramatic packing, no second guessing. I left early before the city fully stirred and drove straight to the bank. The decision had already been made the night before. This was just the execution. The lobby carried that familiar, neutral, calm, muted voices, polished floors, the quiet hum of printers behind glass partitions. I walked to the consultation desk and gave my name. The financial advisor who had helped draft the investment agreement looked up almost immediately. Recognition crossed his face, followed by something more careful. "I had a feeling I'd see you again," he said gently. "Which clause are we discussing?" There was no small talk. He already understood this wasn't routine. "I want to stop all automatic payments flowing from my account into the restaurant system," I said. He nodded once and began pulling up the files. The recurring transfers had been structured during the recovery phase buffer payments to stabilize cash flow, quiet reinforcements that kept suppliers satisfied and inventory steady. A few confirmations later, the automatic transactions were frozen. "That will take effect immediately," he said. "Any further payments would have to be initiated directly by the restaurant's operating account, directly by whoever was legally running it now." I didn't comment. I simply continued. "I also want the supplier credit lines I set up canceled. All of them." He paused, briefly, making sure he heard me correctly. Those credit lines had been the safety net vendors relying on my financial standing to clear invoices when timing got tight. "If we close those," he said carefully, "vendors won't be able to process new orders under your authorization. That's the point." He documented the request without argument. Forms printed, signatures required. Each page slid across the desk with quiet finality. I signed them steadily, my hand not shaking once. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the agreement. "There's one more thing." He read the clause again, the one I had inserted months earlier. Full capital retrieval permitted if transparency within the partnership was compromised. He looked up at me. "You're invoking this?" "Yes." He studied the language one more time before nodding. "You're within your rights, as long as the withdrawal request is submitted in writing." He printed the final form. I signed it. That signature didn't feel impulsive. It felt measured, considered, earned. Within minutes, the capital that had stabilized their recovery was scheduled for full withdrawal. The structure I had quietly supported was no longer attached to me. When I stood to leave, there was no dramatic speech, no hesitation, just a simple acknowledgement from the advisor, It's been processed. Outside, the air felt cooler than usual. I walked toward my car keys, steady in my hand. Before I even opened the door, my phone buzzed. Then again, and again. Notification after notification from the restaurant's management system. Payment failed. Transaction declined. Authorization revoked. I didn't need to open them to know exactly what was happening on the other side. For the first time, the system was running without me, and they were about to feel it. The first supplier hold came quietly. A produce truck idled behind the restaurant at 5:12 a.m., then pulled away without unloading. By 7, the kitchen manager was on the phone, confusion turning to strain as she listened. "I'm sorry," the distributor repeated. "Your credit line has been suspended pending account review." By 9:03, more vendors had delivered the same message. Fresh seafood on hold, specialty flour cash only, wine allocation frozen. No one had prepared for this. Aaron stood in the middle of the dining room with his phone pressed to his ear, pacing in sharp, erratic circles. His voice rose with every call. "There has to be a mistake. We've never missed a payment." But the answer was always the same. The automatic payments had been stopped. The capital guarantee had been withdrawn. The supplier credit facility had been revoked due to contractual breach. By lunch service, substitutions began. Frozen shrimp replaced fresh. A cheaper olive oil appeared on prep tables. 2 signature dishes were marked unavailable. Regular customers noticed. By dinner, the first review appeared online. "Not the same quality. Something's off." Then another. Waited 40 minutes. Food cold. Staff seemed stressed. Then 3 more. Within 48 hours, the rating dropped half a star. Inside the kitchen, morale cracked. Payroll cleared that week, but barely. Vendors began requesting payment on delivery. Cash flow tightened instantly. Staff started asking quiet questions in corners. "Is the restaurant in trouble?" Aaron's answers were defensive clipped. "No, this is temporary. We're restructuring." But the systems he'd taken credit for were no longer buffering the pressure. Meredith's financial architecture, the silent stabilizer, was gone. Midweek, the pastry chef resigned. "I can't risk unpaid invoices hitting my suppliers," she told the manager. "My reputation matters." 2 servers followed by Friday. The dining room felt thinner. The energy changed. Then came Saturday night. The kitchen ran out of 3 core ingredients before 8 p.m. A birthday table waited 25 minutes for entrees that had to be remade because substitutions weren't approved. A guest asked to speak to management. Aaron came out, jaw-tight smile forced. The guest mentioned declining quality. Aaron snapped. "If you understood how restaurants actually work," he said too loudly, "you'd know we're operating just fine." Someone recorded it. The clip. Aaron's dismissive tone, the guest's stunned expression, the awkward silence of nearby tables spread quickly online. Within hours, it was circulating on local food pages. Captioned, "Owner meltdown. Reservations began canceling Sunday morning." Denise called Meredith that afternoon. 6 missed calls, 3 voice messages. "Sweetheart, this is getting out of hand. We need you to explain what's happening with the accounts." Jeffrey texted, "This isn't the time for pride. If you cut something, fix it." Aaron sent 1 message late that night. "If this is some kind of lesson, it's gone too far." Meredith read them all. She did not respond. She had expected turbulence. She had not engineered collapse, only enforced accountability. The clause she invoked was clear compromise transparency, triggered capital protection. The suppliers had simply acted according to contractual structure. She did not gloat. She did not soften. By Wednesday of the following week, lunch service was half full. Two more vendors refused delivery without prepayment. The wine list shrank to 5 bottles. Denise visited 2 local banks seeking short-term financing. They asked for audited statements. Jeffrey called extended relatives. No one wanted to invest in a restaurant trending online for instability. Aaron's social media post meant to reassure. Customers was met with comments asking about unpaid suppliers. On Friday morning, the front door remained locked until noon. At 2:15 p.m., a printed sign appeared in the window. Closed temporarily due to operational restructuring. The word temporarily felt fragile. Inside, staff boxed personal belongings. The kitchen cooled. Refrigerators hummed around shelves that were no longer full. Denise sat at a corner table staring at the dining room she had imagined would secure their legacy. Jeffrey folded and refolded the printed closure notice. Aaron stood by the host stand, phone in hand, refreshing feeds that would not change. Meredith did not come. She did not call. She did not step in again. By Sunday evening, the restaurant's website updated, closed indefinitely. The lights stayed off, and Meredith, miles away, remained silent. The liquidation moved quickly. Equipment was cataloged, photographed, and auctioned in batches. Stainless steel prep tables, the imported oven Aaron once bragged about. The wine fridge Denise had insisted was an investment in prestige. Each item reduced to numbers on a clipboard, then a line item on a sales sheet. The sign came down last. The space emptied faster than anyone expected. Aaron tried to recover publicly. He applied for management roles across the city, leaning heavily on the title he'd briefly held. But references were requested. Financial records were reviewed. The viral clip resurfaced in more than one interview. Calls stopped coming. At home, conversation thinned into logistics. No one mentioned Meredith directly. No one apologized. The silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was hollow. Meredith stayed quiet through it all. She finalized the last of the paperwork, confirmed her accounts were stable, and declined every indirect attempt to reopen communication through extended relatives. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just clarity. A month later, she packed her apartment. Leaving Texas wasn't dramatic. No farewell dinner, no announcement. Just a forwarding address and a one-way flight to a city where no one introduced her as someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's safety net. For the first time, loyalty and self-respect were not in conflict. She understood something she hadn't before. Boundaries are not punishment. They are protection. Silence is not weakness. It is control. She chose peace over proximity, and she did not look back. Thank you for listening to Meredith's story. It's a reminder that loyalty without boundaries can cost more than we realize, and that self-worth sometimes means walking away even when it hurts. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments, and if you'd like to support more stories like this, your quiet encouragement truly means a lot.